All right, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world today. And welcome to today's webinar, Are You Getting the Most Out of Your Data? And I am your hostess for today, Terry Carden, founder of ReviewMyAMS and creator of AMS Best. And I am just thrilled to be here with you for the next hour. But what's even cooler than the fact that I get to hang out with all of you wonderful people for the next hour is the fact that our co-hosts for today, the wonderful Cobalt team, are annual supporters of ReviewMyAMS. And so for those of you that may not know, ReviewMyAMS is home to more than 850 end user reviews on more than 60 association management platforms, including Cobalt. With the help of Cobalt and other angel supporters of ReviewMyAMS, we've just been able to launch a fresh new look with tons of new features and filters of the ReviewMyAMS website. So if you're a happy Cobalt client, I know they would love to see a review from you. So after this webinar, just step on over to ReviewMyAMS.com and share your end user opinion. I'll introduce you to Chris in just a moment, but first let's cover a couple of housekeeping items. Most of you are probably familiar with the GoToWebinar system, so you should have a questions tab. So feel free to enter your questions at any time into the questions tab. We don't want to interrupt the flow of today's webinar, so we are going to save some time at the end of the hour, about 10 or 15 minutes or so, to field all your wonderful questions. So again, just step on over to the questions tab if you have a question for Chris, and feel free to enter that at any time. So, enough about me and ReviewMyAMS. Let's get down to today's business. And for that, I'm going to introduce you to our expert, Chris Capistran, president of Cobalt CRM Solutions. What's cool about Chris is that he's actually been working in the association industry since 1994. Yes, that was before I graduated high school, Chris. In fact, his first job out of college was with the American Council of Engineering Companies, ASAE. Chris joined Cobalt in 1998, and he's been working with membership and certification customers to build strong solutions and relationships ever since. In his spare time, when he's not playing with the latest technologies from Microsoft, he enjoys spending time with his wife, Courtney, and his daughters, Lauren and Emily. And he's got a cute little big old alley on his hands, too, in beautiful Old Town Alexandria, especially when he can he loves being in beautiful Old Town Alexandria, especially when he could take the top off his Jeep and go for a ride along the Potomac. So, without further ado, take it away, Chris. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Thanks, Terry. Now you made me feel older than I already feel every day here at Cobalt.
Now, come on.
So, thanks everybody for joining today. As Terry said, I'm Chris Capistran. I'm Cobalt's president. And today we're going to talk about member data and how you can get more out of the data you might already have or you might not even know that you have. This is not a Cobalt sales presentation. This is meant to provide some insight in some things that we've learned over the years related to member data, and hopefully can help you guys regardless of the CRM or AMS system that you are using. So with that said, a quick reminder, if you do have questions, just put them in the questions pane, and I will do my best to get to all of those at the end of the session. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So on this first slide, you see a nice quote here. You don't have to read the whole thing. This is actually an excerpt from ASAE magazine. I assume most of you know who ASAE is, but just in case you don't, ASAE is the American Society of Association Executives. I always explain it to new hires at Cobalt as the association for associations or association people. And so this quote is really talking about how it's very challenging to attract new members and maintain membership with how everything is changing, and that perceptions were different a decade ago, and belonging to organizations and participating in them was much more of the norm. But now that that has changed, and that expectation no longer exists. So sounds like it rings pretty true. And I said this was an excerpt from ASAE magazine, but this excerpt is actually from 1989. So that was even before I graduated from high school. So, you know, I start with this quote because I think it really emphasizes that, you know, the challenge of recruiting and retaining members isn't something that's new. It's really been around for a long time. The good news and the purpose of this is to know that we have a lot more tools and techniques available today that we didn't really have in 1989. So my goal is to, in this webinar, is to really show you how and why you should go deeper when you're looking at your data, because ultimately all of this comes back to, you know, to growing the association, retaining members in other areas and other programs within the association. So that's why I like to start with that quote. So I put these two numbers up here. This actually was a survey that was conducted by ASAE. See, I told you this wasn't a Cobalt commercial. ASAE, obviously, they make IMIS. Everyone, I assume most people are familiar with IMIS. They've been around for a long time, still probably the largest AMS vendor in the space. And I was really surprised. They surveyed their customer base, which is reasonably large, and they found that 21% weren't able to put their finger on their member retention rate. And that 25% of them didn't know what their market share was. Now, I'm pretty sure that if we really pressed these groups, they could come up with, or at least, you know, be sort of pushed into figuring out a retention rate. But the fact that 1 in 4 associations didn't really know where they stood in terms of their potential members is a pretty staggering number to me. Cobalt works pretty closely with the National Association of Realtors. I think we have at least 1 or 2 people on the line from NAR, and we work with their state and local associations quite a bit. The real estate market is kind of unique because it really is a reasonably known universe. You know, and they know in general that about 50% of licensed real estate agents are realtors. I like to joke here when NAR people aren't on the phone that all the advertising and PR that they do, you probably think that the number of realtors is a little bit higher. Now, of course, at 50%, they still have about 500,000 realtors. So working at the local level with these groups, most of them not only know their market share, but they actually have a pretty good list of all the real estate agents who aren't realtors, and they actively market to these people. So the real estate world is sort of cyclical and nomadic. People sort of come in and out of the profession, they move around a lot, and so these local state associations are constantly working to gain new members and maintain their member numbers year over year. So the reason I tell this story is because it's really hard to take action if you don't really know where you're starting from or what your goals are or what you're trying to attain. So I just like to tell that story to highlight that point. So at Cobalt, we use the term AMS and CRM pretty much interchangeably. CRM standing for Customer Relationship Management. And we really love to preach the CRM Lifecycle. And so we believe that one of the main functions of any AMS or CRM system is to really allow you to acquire data, analyze data, and then adapt based on the analysis that you've done against that data. So it's really important to focus on all 3 stages of this life cycle. Acquiring data, obviously a good first step. Doing some level of analysis is even better. But the 3rd step is where the magic happens. Being able to adapt how you run your organization based on the data and analysis is where you start to see some real value. So Now let's look at what I like to call the big three. So the big three of data when it comes to associations, I like to look at member acquisition, member retention, and market share. So let's look at those real quick. Member acquisition, this is about as straightforward of a number as it gets. You know, how many new members are you bringing in each month, quarter, year, whatever period you want to track it against? You know, that's a good number to track. And we'll talk about going a little deeper in a moment. But, you know, the one sort of key here is also looking at that raw number isn't really telling much of a story. You really need to add some context, historical numbers, trends, etc. And I'll get more into that later. Member retention. This is a really important number for a lot of membership-based organizations. You know, in the commercial world that you know I live in, and some of our other customers kind of deal with, you know, we really talk about how, depending on the industry or what you're selling, it can be 5 to 10 times more expensive to acquire a new customer than it is to retain a current customer. So member retention, customer retention is a very important statistic, and it's a key to your business. Some people are intimidated by this. It's a little bit more complicated than just straight up acquisition, but it is really pretty easy to calculate. You're just looking at total number of members at the end of a period, let's say a year. You subtract the new members, and then you divide it by the number of members at the beginning of the period. So it's really not super complicated to calculate member retention. You should be able to do it. It's fairly straightforward. Market share, probably the trickiest of these big three items, because the hardest part here is really defining your market. If you're in an industry like, again, I'll go back to the realtors, relatively straightforward because they have a known universe that they're marketing for. Terry mentioned that I used to work at ASAE. It was a trade association for engineering companies with some fairly defined metrics. They're actually a pretty good example. When I worked there, their acronym was the same, but it was actually the American Consulting Engineers Council. So they were focusing on a niche within the engineering world, and they sort of broadened, changing the name, keeping the same acronym, really broadened their overall market, because when I was there, at some point, you reach some saturation of market, and the only way to really grow is to expand your reach. So, you know, but again, just as a teaser, you can't really analyze how you're doing if you don't know your market share. But it also has to be within context, as I was saying about ASAE, is if your acquisition is slowed over the past 3 years, that may be because now you all of a sudden have 90 or 95% of your total universe of potential members. So you have to sort of look at all those numbers in context. So now let's take a look at member engagement. We sort of looked at the baseline, and now we're going to sort of slowly kind of move up to, you know, next level and deeper dive. If I was giving this talk 10 years ago, people really wouldn't have been too familiar with member engagement. Now, you know, it's really been a hot topic, especially over the last 5 years. And it's a real priority for a lot of our customers and other associations to figure out how to better engage with their members and then quantify that engagement so they can use that information. This slide here is actually from one of our customers. They keep a leaderboard on their website. This happens to be part of a Higher Logic online community for the Dynamics 365 user group, and they really push it out there in terms of here are the most engaged members on a week-by-week basis. At this point, most vendors, including Cobalt, have some way of tracking and calculating member engagement, but this is really only a means to an end. You know, you have some formulas, some calculations, some weighting of activities, but at the end, we really should be focusing on these three things. So relative score. So on this slide, you'll see Marva Dockery here. She has 192 points. Well, I don't know what that really means just looking at the raw numbers, but if I know that that puts her in the top 10%, then that starts to give me some more information about that. Trends over time, another important thing to look at. So we have Nelson Johnson here. Well, maybe Nelson is the top 10% for 6 months, but then all of a sudden you see that he drops down to 0. But looking for trends and things like that can really help. You know, did he go on vacation? Did he change jobs and move out of the industry? You know, maybe establishing trends and looking for people with dramatic shifts in their engagement scores could require some sort of outreach, either automated or manually, depending on the size of the organization. You know, and then finally, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it's what does this score mean in relation to other numbers or metrics or actions that are going on? Again, looking at one individual metric in a vacuum doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story. So next thing we're going to talk about is Net Promoter Score. So this is actually one of my favorite metrics. You know, it's really used widely. It was first adopted mostly by retailers. They really like this score. They really put a lot of stock into it. I like it just because it's really simple. You can ask customers, or in this case members, how likely are they to refer you to someone else? And you ask them on this 1 to 10 scale. So you're really getting to the essence of, okay, you're a member of my organization. How likely are you to mention to your peers that it would be a good idea for them to also become members? Then once you get those numbers, you break them into the 3 buckets that we see here: detractors, passives, and promoters. Once you get the groups to get to the score that you see on here, the 65 in the example that I have here, you subtract the percentage of detractors from promoters to get your score. So that's great to have the score. A lot of companies actually use this to sort of tout themselves and talk about, you know, how highly they score. USAA, a lot of people familiar with that organization, especially in the DC area. They're always very close to the top. They have a very high referral rating and satisfaction rating as an organization, and they, you know, they promote that. You know, but that's really only part of the story. You know, tracking it over time is also crucial. Maybe you have a finicky membership base. You know, maybe a score of 50 is really the best you can hope for. So you shouldn't necessarily compare yourselves against the Zappos and the USAA and some of the other groups that traditionally score high across all industries. You should really look at it in light of the world that you live in. So if, you know, you were at for 5 years, you were between like 45 and 48, and all of a sudden your score drops to a 40, well, now that's an indicator that something might be wrong. Or it could be also a leading indicator that's going to tell you that down the road you could start to see some retention issues. So again, context is key here, and then also being able to link it to other data can be enlightening. Funny thing when we introduce this to people is that most people's first instinct is to figure out how they can take all the 0s and the 1s and the 2s and the 3s and get them to 9s and 10s. Unfortunately, most research and studies on this basically say that you're wasting your time trying to take the people really at the bottom of the scale and get them to the top. That's why 0 to 6 is lumped into this one single category. Instead of trying to bring those people up the scale, you want to make sure that you focus on keeping the people that are already 9s and 10s happy, and potentially getting those passives to move into the promoter territory. You don't want to be spending time on 1s and 2s and lose track of what is keeping your your current promoters happy. So that's really, really a good lesson that we've learned over the years from that. Okay, so now that we've looked at a couple of examples, we've got the big three. We've talked about acquisition, retention, and market share. We looked at member engagement and net promoter score. Let's talk about some more practical steps to take. Because I'm assuming that a lot of you guys were aware of most of what we've already talked about today. I like to always set a baseline. Hopefully some of that was insightful, but you know, I want to start jumping into some more advanced discussions. So first, let's start with what we should be collecting. My first point here is we really need to remember that sometimes data can be fleeting, meaning that if we don't capture it when it happens, it could be lost forever. You know, an easy to understand example of this for anyone who's in marketing and communications and has seen this or technology are website logs. So when people come to your website, whatever web server you're using is logging all kinds of data going on, depending on how you've configured it. So a really simple one is something like what browser the people are using when they hit your website. Well, you can't decide 3 years after you launch your new website that you want to go back and see all the browsers if you didn't track that from the start. You really need to capture that data point in time, and you're going to lose the opportunity. And then the best you can do there is track the data going forward. So this is why I always encourage customers to track as much data as is practical so they don't regret it down the line. So, you know, when I say track as much data as practical, so okay, Chris, what is practical? You know, I always say practical is anything that doesn't put a burden on your budget, your system's performance, or your customer's experience. So, you know, budget, hopefully in the world we live in today of, you know, very inexpensive storage and SaaS-based or online systems that, you know, cost of data storage and things like that really shouldn't come into play anymore. So hopefully budget really isn't that big of a consideration. So the next two are really important. You know, again, system performance. So, you know, if you're collecting mounds and mounds of data from people, sometimes that can, you know, cause system performance if you're just going really overboard. But again, in a modern world that we live in, that should hopefully be a non-issue if you're on a modern system. But the one that's really important is user experience. So the last thing you want to do is you want to be able to track data, but you also don't want to ask conference attendees 50 additional questions as part of their registration process, just so you can collect some more data. You're going to end up frustrating people as they go through the process, because now you've ruined their user experience for the purpose of collecting additional data, and that's not good. That's why a lot of times what you want to try to do is track that behavioral data or experiential data about what people are doing and what their behavior is. People who live in marketing, you know, do this all the time. When you're looking at, you know, your marketing automation tool can do heat maps of what people are clicking on. I'm actually looking at GoToWebinar. They have a really cool tool that's collecting along the way. As it tells you of all the attendees, it tells you who's paying attention or not, which I think is pretty cool. I won't call anybody out, but you know, it's looking at, like, if you're clicking on stuff on your other screen and you're not focused on that application, like GoToMeeting actually tracks that for people to figure out how engaged people are while they're watching this webinar. So I'm not asking you any additional questions for that, but it's sort of monitoring that experience. So that's a nice way, if you can collect that data in the background based on behavior and not really ruin your customer or member experience, that's always good. The last point, you know, that I want to make here is to talk about keeping data in its raw form or flattening it out. So I'm going to show an example of that in a minute, but what that really does also, the raw data is good because you're collecting as much data as you can. So we talked about log files for your website. That's about as raw as it gets. It just stores these text files on your web server, and then you can go back and manipulate them and do what you want later. When we talk about flattening out data, I'm going to give you an example of that to give you some practical application to that. So as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, this is not a product showcase for Cobalt or Microsoft Dynamics 365, but I have to show you the context in the world that I live in. So I wanted to show you something very simple, very straightforward. It's not proprietary to to Microsoft or Cobalt. You could use the same technique, with any system. We happen to include this as part of our Membership Dynamics product. We've created this very simple, we call engagement activity record. So what this basically does, it's all trigger-based using workflows, and when a member or customer does something in the system, that can be a membership app, a renewal, an event registration, a post on your online community, they could send an email, staff could make a phone call to that person and log it. Really anything that happens in the system, you can hook this up to your system and create these activities when the event happens. You could even take it one step further, and if you could hook it into your marketing automation platform, you could even, if you've got one of the more modern platforms, you could even create activities based on people browsing your website and track that back against their customer record to get a real, again, behavioral picture of what they're doing. But the real key and what I'm trying to drive home here is the simplicity of this and the fact that it's flat. And when I say flat, it means that we're storing it in one place. So in this example, I've got who the person is. Victoria Abbott is the customer here. And I've got a type. I've decided to assign some revenue. So she paid $850 for this action. If it wasn't something that had revenue, you could leave that blank. And you could even have points be assigned to it at the time that it's created, or you could go back and do that analysis later. You can even add your own fields, for different things that you want to track. But what this flat structure does is now all of these are stored in one place, or in database world in one table. And that makes it really easy to retrieve and analyze the data. So if you don't flatten this data out, anyone who's ever had to write a report or ask somebody to write a report and probably listen to them complain about it, is that if you had to go back and compare and say, let's write an engagement score report that's looking at their event registrations, their renewal activity, their emails, and you had to join all of that together and then write the calculations and try to figure out how to roll that up into a report, it's really, really complicated and painful, which is why a lot of people don't like to write those types of reports. And so that's really where this flattening out of the data, we find is really key to being able to run those reports, and it makes it more accessible to users. So that was just an example that I like to show, but it's more of a technique than an example. Okay, so we've talked about some key statistics here. Again, engagement, market share, retention, and net promoter. We've discussed, that you should try to capture as much data as you can at the time that it's created. You might miss the opportunity to track it if you don't do that. So now you've collected all of this data. And I know that this is probably just, these metrics that I'm throwing out there are kind of just the tip of the iceberg. They're really not comprehensive, but obviously you can track a ton of different data and do different analysis. But we wanted to start somewhere and use some examples. But now that we have this, the question is, what do I do with all this data? So if you do any research, or you've been going to conferences and hearing all the buzzwords, you hear big data, data lakes, data scientists, it can get pretty intimidating, especially if you don't, come from a business intelligence or analytics or database background. But one of the things I like to always talk about is what you should really start with is asking questions of the data that you're seeing. So when you look at these metrics that we've talked about, just start asking simple questions. Well, why have we seen a decrease in conference registrations over the past 3 years? Okay, maybe we should dig a little deeper. So asking those questions of why or where or how, that's really a good starting point for you to get into that. And the other thing is people get intimidated by, I need all these tools and things, but most of the systems you already have, your CRM/AMS, if you've got marketing automation software or an online community or a website content management platform, you've got access to plenty of data to get started. And more than likely, those systems come with some tools to help you analyze that data. So the key is to collect it, review it, and ask questions, which kind of goes back to my CRM Lifecycle slide from the beginning of the presentation. So now let's dig into some practical examples of why going deeper than just looking at the surface is so important. So we talked about, membership growth, year-over-year growth. So we look at these two associations, Association A and Association B. I know, I guess I'm not that creative. They both had 1,000 members in 2016, and they had 1,200 in 2017. So they had a net increase of 200 members. So that's fairly easy to calculate, 20% growth. And you can have organizations talk about, well, we've grown this much year over year. We do that at Cobalt from a sales standpoint and a revenue standpoint. But that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And so that's why I break down these two different groups, because on the surface, seems like the same story, but it really isn't. If Association A had 700 renewals and 500 new members to get to their 1,200, and B was 900 renewals plus 300 new members to get to their 1,200, those are pretty different stories to tell. A has a retention rate of 70% and B is 90%. They're both doing a really good job bringing in new members from a percentage basis, but A seems to be losing a decent amount of people year over year. So knowing that we talked about it's more expensive to attract new members than it is to retain current members, maybe Association A needs to dig in and find out why they lost so many members, especially if this continues year over year. So you could say, oh, we did 20%, but maybe if you got your retention rate up to 80 or 90%, your growth rate could be more in the 30 to 40% range. So it's always good to dig a little bit deeper. If you're only reporting on the growth numbers, that number, 20%, may look like a pretty good number, but there could be room for improvement if you dig a little bit deeper. So this brings me to one of my favorite terms that I use a lot when you talk about data. And I really like to talk about vanity metrics. So when you only look at the surface level or the high level numbers, I'd like to refer to those as vanity metrics. And to me, the top vanity metric that is out there is website visitors in the marketing world. So yeah, so we increased our website visitors month over month or year over year, and that's a great thing, especially on the marketing side. You see a lot of marketing teams or marketing firms touting that number. But if every one of those new visitors, for example, hits your homepage or the one blog post you're promoting, and then they leave, then that increase in visitors really isn't helping. You really need to start looking at some other metrics. At Cobalt, we do a lot with this, and we look at things like, bounce rate or page views per visitor. So bounce rate basically tells you how often people are coming in, hitting a page, and then just leaving. And then obviously average page views per visit gives you a deeper story of, how deep are people going into your website. And so, if your visits are are skyrocketing, but your bounce rate's around 90%, it's possible that you're attracting the wrong people, or your website needs some work in terms of navigation and architecture. So again, just going a little bit below the surface, you may uncover some trends or some issues, because now the data is telling us something. So maybe redesigning your homepage or creating some additional content that's really aimed at attracting the right audience will really help you have more effective content. And it may end up that less content is better if it's more effective traffic. So again, that's just a pretty simple example looking at web traffic. We actually had a group that we partner with, and we were using the same marketing automation software, and we were trading stories back and forth, and they put out a bunch of blog posts around a certain topic, and they were really looking at targeting businesses, not individuals, for this specific product. And they saw this huge rush of leads and people coming in, but it was all individual consumers and not the businesses they were targeting. So they had to go back and rethink their strategy. So again, this isn't a webinar on inbound marketing and website content effectiveness, but I thought it was a good example of just going one level deeper into that. The other example that I like to look at is Net Promoter Score and membership engagement. So depending on how you collect your data, it may not be possible to necessarily link these two explicitly, because it's often better to get Net Promoter Score as an anonymous survey or metric. People a lot of times will give you more honest feedback if you're doing that anonymously. But we worked with a group a few years ago, and they were really pushing hard to increase engagement, because they assumed that engagement meant higher renewal rate. And so that was their real focus. If we can only engage our members more, they'll be happier and they'll renew. But then as they started to dig in and look at some other peripheral numbers, they started to realize that a large number of their members didn't want to engage anymore. It was a real eye-opener. They were happy with the products and services they were receiving as part of their membership, and the items that this group was assigning a high value on from a membership engagement standpoint, they found out that really didn't correlate with satisfaction or renewal rates. So again, it's important to challenge assumptions and really make sure that it's always good to start with assumptions and then go back and revisit those and make sure that they're accurate. In the end of the day, it was definitely good for them to know who their more engaged members were, because those were still good targets for volunteer and leadership opportunities, but that didn't necessarily correlate with renewals. People were perfectly happy with all the self-service things that they were doing, and they had some pretty solid member benefits. So the fact that they weren't signing up for additional webinars or attending events was not necessarily an indication of how satisfied they were with their membership. So the final example that I'll talk about in this section is also a fairly simple thing to think about, but again, I'm trying to keep these relatively straightforward. You can think about how it applies to your organization. But if you've got an age-diverse membership, you should always really be looking at slicing and dicing your data by age group. Again, this can be challenging if you're not collecting birthdays. Some people mitigate this by, instead of asking for people's birthdays, you ask for them to put themselves in a bucket by generation, or you can maybe get some information on when they graduated from schools or things like that to be able to infer or at least put them into buckets. But as we talked about back on that first slide, if you're having challenges or you're worried about attracting new members and you're reading articles about catering to millennials now becoming the largest group in the workforce, and it's important, and you're trying to keep your association relevant as you move into the future, you need to be careful to watch your renewal and satisfaction ratings for what I'll call your more experienced members, you could be losing long-time members because you've overcompensated. Again, back to that net promoter score of, don't focus too much on bringing in new people or, unsatisfied people. You have to remember that you've got your core, your loyal base. Don't deviate too far from that. So make sure that you've always got a balance there, and that you're not neglecting a certain subset of your membership. So again, that comes back to this, acquire data, analyze it, and then adapt. Maybe you need to add some programs back that work more effectively for people who are later in their careers in order to make sure you're continuing to engage them. So as we talked about a few minutes ago, I want to make sure that I make it clear that you don't need a rocket scientist, or in this case, a data scientist, to really get started. The first thing you really need to do is just make sure you're capturing the data that you need or that you think you'll need. I know this is pretty simple, but one of the things that we get a lot at Cobalt is we get requests from customers, and you may have these requests internally as well, where people are asking for reports or dashboards, and they're asking for data. They're asking for these reports, and we have to go back and say, well, the report you're looking for, the data doesn't exist in the system to support this report. We even look at that a lot of times in new implementations as we're onboarding new customers. We start with that and we say, okay, what are your key reports that you need to pull out of the system? Because that's usually a good way to kind of back our way into functionality or data that needs to exist. So if you have some key metrics or reports, you need to make sure that the data is there to support it. Take the time to really step back and make sure you're capturing that data. It's also important not to get discouraged or frustrated, or in my world, don't get too angry at your provider if this data doesn't already exist. It's never too late to start. The worst thing you can do is say, oh, we don't have that data, forget it. I guess we're never going to be able to track that. Well, as Terry mentioned, I've been in this industry for a long time. You'd be surprised how quickly 2, 3, 5 years goes by. So you start tracking the data today going forward, and now you've got a few years out, now you've got some really solid data. If you just throw your hands in the air and say there's nothing we can do, you're going to look back and say, oh man, I wish when I realized that 3 years ago, I started tracking that data. So, once you have the data, again, like I talked about, use the tools that you're already paying for. AMS, CRM, marketing automation platform, online community, like these tools already exist in a lot of things. If they don't exist, then you can start looking at something like Excel. Excel is a great tool to use. There's also BI tools out there, business intelligence tools out there. We live in Microsoft world, so we are partial to Power BI, which is Microsoft's business intelligence tool, but there are other tools like Tableau and some other tools out there that are very powerful in terms of business intelligence. Take advantage of those tools. I'm kind of an Excel nerd, so I do a lot in Excel. Excel is a lot more powerful than people give it credit for. So you don't need super expensive tools or dedicated staff or big data analysis, things like that. And then finally, establish a data culture. So maybe it sounds a little bit hokey, but it really is. If you really sort of, I don't want to say get obsessed, but up to obsession, if you really start to think about this and have this front of mind with everybody, then it really becomes a lot easier to collect that data. When somebody's sending out some communication or they're building a new registration form, again, don't inundate your members with survey questions and things like that, but think about, oh, while I'm doing this, is there a key piece of data that I could collect or get people to update while they're in process to do this? So really establishing that culture, and the culture extends back to that idea of analyze and adapt with the data that you're collecting. So really getting that ingrained in your team or your organization to say, on a quarterly or annual basis, let's take a step back, look at the numbers, and have honest conversations Don't just do things anecdotally, you know, overreacting because a small subset of more vocal members, you know, may be voicing their opinion. Kind of to take that into consideration, but really look back at the data, and that all kind of goes back into that overall data data culture of your organization. So I'm on my 45 minutes. That's what I had planned out. So I guess I planned it out reasonably well. I hope that this was helpful. I know, you know, in an hour session, it's hard to get too deep into this. I really wanted to provide, you know, an overview and some techniques of what people could take back. I guess, Terry, we can look to see if we have any questions that we can look at, and
yeah, sure. So, yeah, a couple of validations of your advice or the points that you made have come through from Alan. So thanks for your participation there, Alan. He did have a question though that is in relation to GDPR. So he's asking, is the advice about tracking as much as is practical and keeping the data raw and or flat? Is it dangerous outside of the context of the looming GDPR and the movement toward data privacy and protection?
Right. So I think that, you know, obviously the one thing we talk about, that behavioral data, which is easy to anonymize. So when you're looking at trends, a lot of that data can then be disconnected from the customer. So you're doing that at a macro level. So that's kind of the first thing when you're looking at, you know, web traffic or behavioral type data or how people are interacting with stuff. You know, you can really get around that as long as you're disclosing that you're tracking that data from GDPR purposes. Like, and if you're explicitly anonymizing it, or if the person asks to be forgotten, you're sort of disconnecting that from the customer themselves. That's obviously the easiest way to look at that stuff from a macro level. And then, you know, we've been doing a lot with GDPR. Obviously, it's a hot topic. We're under 48 hours until it goes into place. And, you know, we've really all been spending a lot of time on that. I think the key there is we always talk about being good stewards of the data. And so I think as long as you're upfront with the customers and you allow them an idea of what you're collecting, the safe way around that, what we've done to a lot of our customers is that aggregate data is doing it anonymously and disconnecting it from the customer is a nice way to then not have to worry about that long term, because you don't really necessarily care who the person is. You're really just trying to match that data back. But then having some good practices for that specific data you are collecting, making sure that they can come onto your website and be able to see that and access that is always a good first practice. Now, if you really dig into this, and we don't want to get too much into GDPR, but the one key there is that a lot of people are worried. You really just need to have the capability to reply to those requests and disconnect the people. So if somebody comes and says, I want to see all the data you have on me, you don't necessarily need for them to be able to view that on demand on your website. You just need to have the capability of pulling that out and reporting it. So again, I think back to the raw and flat. In our world, you're tying all of that back as engagement activities to the person. So it's really easy to pull out that report. If somebody ever asked for it, like, what data are you keeping on me? You could really quickly dump out a report of all the engagement activities and show that to the customer. And you could also pretty easily disconnect that from the customer. So I hope that answers your question, Alan.
All right. Yeah, thanks for asking. Anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to use the questions tab there for Chris, and he'll do the best he can to answer it. Here's another one, and I think you may have already answered this partly, but let's see if you can jump in a little bit deeper. I've got many sources of data, like website, online community, AMS. What's the best way to handle all those multiple data sources?
Right. So I talked about how a lot of those items, a lot of the different systems have tools for analyzing the data. Of course, they're only analyzing the data in that system. But when you get into multiple data sources, one of the things that we talk with our customers We talk about, your AMS or your CRM system being the hub of your operations. We like a lot of best of breed software. So if you're using an online community or a marketing automation tool, it's always good to be using the best of breeds or a learning management system. But then ultimately you've got data living in those different systems. And in a lot of cases, it makes sense to bring some of that data back into your AMS or CRM system. In other cases, it doesn't. And we really talk about the idea of don't integrate just for the sake of reporting. So if you want that 360-degree view of your customer and you want that inside of your AMS or CRM system, that makes total sense. But in terms of some of this deeper dive or analytics, that's where it starts to make sense to use some sort of other business intelligence tool to aggregate that data. Again, you could start with something as simple as Excel. If you can pull the raw data out of multiple systems and get them inside of Excel and manipulate them in that way, that's one way to do it. Sort of the next level of that, again, is a tool like a Microsoft Power BI. People who are Office 360, you don't need to use the Dynamics 365 platform that we use in order to get access to Power BI. If you're using Office 365, or of course Microsoft will sell it to you, even if you're not a current Office 365 customer, it's a pretty effective tool. There's a free version and a relatively inexpensive pro version. That allows you to really pull in data from multiple sources, and that can be through data connections directly to a database or in combination with flat files. So if you've got an Excel spreadsheet and a connection to your CRM system and a connection to your marketing automation system, you can pull all of that into one place and use that for analytics. So that's really where we get into, that's probably step 2 in your analysis of using the tools you have today, and then the next step up is going to a BI tool. So
okay. All right. Well, it looks like we may have exhausted all of the questions that have come through then. So it looks like we'll be wrapping up just a few minutes early. I want to say thank you, Chris, for sharing your wealth of information. I learned some things here that I didn't know for sure, and I hope everybody else that's been on the line today has also learned stuff. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for the entire Cobalt team for being annual supporters of ReviewMyAMS. And this webinar has been recorded, so it will be sent to your inbox in the next few days by the Cobalt team. You can also check out the key takeaways on the ReviewMyAMS blog in the next coming days. And we are happy that you joined us today. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Terry.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.